Hej! Välkomna tillbaka. In the late 1600s, a world-renowned Swedish scientist named Olof Rudbeck made the bold and sensational claim that Atlantis wasn't in the Mediterranean, but in Sweden. It was controversial even in his day, and today you will be hard-pressed to find anyone who believes him. To the extent his work is even remembered, it's often treated as a laughingstock, or, when taken more seriously, still handled with a layer of sarcastic distancing. Even though, for instance, Gunnar Eriksson shares my sentiment, as he on page 137 writes that articles about Rudbeck and his vast opus rarely fail to include some of his astonishing etymologies or conclusions. The idea is that we're supposed to laugh and then reflect on how incredibly much better grasp we have on scientific thinking today. But of course, that is not true. The fantasies just have taken on different forms. And besides, there's an overwhelming risk that some future scholar with some sense of humor will burst out laughing at us. And by then, it won't matter how much we squirm in our graves. Still, it is clear that he thinks Rudbeck's ideas are ridiculous. You might think, well, of course, if it's obviously untrue, right? But here's the interesting thing. While that reaction may well be justified, it doesn't emerge purely from the truth. It comes from a whole system of assumptions and expectations in your mind. Assumptions built on the research of countless others, which you haven't and realistically cannot verify all by yourself in its entirety. Not even close. What you're standing in is what we now call a paradigm. This video will not be focused on the proofs themselves in Olof Rudbeck's work, but rather on how we know what is reasonable proof in the first place, especially in relation to Rudbeck's work. A paradigm is, according to Wikipedia, a distinct set of concepts or thought patterns, including theories, research methods, postulates, and standards for what constitute legitimate contributions to a field. I like to say it's like a big mind puzzle of assumptions and expectations. A puzzle board is like a system of interlocking pieces with specific working arrangement. And when a puzzle piece is introduced from a foreign board, your own puzzle board cannot do anything else but to reject it. It simply does not fit. In your mind, this is why a foreign argument or idea engenders an inner sensation of falsity. It is a foreign puzzle piece which does not fit your assumptions and expectations. To make it fit, you have to rearrange and swap out assumptions and expectations. And as everything is like a logical chain that fits just like a puzzle board, you have to rearrange everything just to make that one single piece fit. Let's say you even get to the point where you're open to the other idea. Swapping out all those pieces still takes loads of effort and time, sometimes even years. why the conversation between two people with different paradigms is so seldom fruitful. But after it is done, you suddenly cannot fit your old pieces anymore. Meaning you cannot think the way you did before. This is in Kuhn's terms a gestalt shift. A total change in perspective. When two people of separate paradigms try to communicate, they do so from either side of the gestalt, which prevents them from understanding each other. We will get back to this point. The thing about paradigms is they're not just intellectual, they're also social. Two people standing in different paradigms will often talk past each other. Not just because they disagree on facts, but because they disagree on what counts as fact, a valid explanation, or even a good question. And the social pressures almost always lean towards the dominant paradigm. Ridicule, group dynamics, politics, career stakes. These shape even the scientific world, where truth seeking is supposed to reign. None of this is to say that Rudbeck's theory necessarily therefore holds equal weight. That is not what I'm saying. But it is to say that what gets investigated in the first place is shaped by these pressures. And that at the very least is worth paying attention to. Due to these social pressures, which this topic is undeniably subject to, I believe that to some extent we've failed to fully live up to our own intellectual standards pertaining to Atlantica. Here is what I mean. In anthropology and history, it's considered poor practice to interpret a past or foreign culture strictly through the modern assumptions. If, say, a society believed that female human sacrifice could stop the rain, it would be considered simplistic, if not even irresponsible, right? To stop at labeling them as superstitious or misogynistic. That kind of what we would call surface reaction filters their worldview through ours. And in doing so, misses the deeper structure of belief that made such practices meaningful to them. Of course, I'm not saying that modern scientists have only reacted to Rudbeck with mockery or dismissal. Many scholars have engaged with his work seriously and thoughtfully. What I am pointing to is more subtle. How our first reactions, the initial emotional and intellectual responses shaped by our current cultural lens, ripple through the rest of the research. And in the case of Atlantica studies, the sarcasm, the distancing, the editorial winks may partly be those ripples. But this disagreement, of course, stems from a long tradition of conflict over fundamental assumptions. What Imre Lakatos would call the hardcore of a theory. The set of commitments that, if disproven, collapse the entire structure. In Rudbeck's case, one of these hardcore assumptions is that ancient texts can be used as legitimate historical sources. Rudbeck himself likened his theory to a house. The foundation, he said, was the geography described in those texts. Relatively stable and less subject to interpretations. The walls and roof were the ancient texts themselves, contingent on the writers being truthful. And then, at the least, he had the ornaments, which were the etymologies. He viewed them as the most speculative layer, subject to taste and preference. For modern historians, however, even the texts that form Rudbeck's foundation, the walls and roof, are often seen as ornamental at best. Under the lens of modern textual criticism, they are considered deeply unreliable, laden with myth, bias, and anachronism. And cross-referential interpretations like Rudbeck's are often seen as flimsy or even arbitrary, lacking methodological rigor. This divergence in trust, particularly in ancient historians, is a core difference between the old and new historical paradigms. And it's a difference so significant that it arguably warrants its own chapter, if not a full series. By engaging seriously with Rudbeck's work, I am in a way breaking an implicit rule of modern historiography and treating a thoroughly rejected framework as if it might still yield insight. This act of exploring a discarded theory, not because I believe it, but just to see what happens, is in Feyerabend's spirit a kind of methodological heresy. So far, this approach has led me to new interesting threads, which I've tentatively categorized as seemingly productive and seemingly degenerative. I emphasize seemingly because, as Lakatos noted, we often cannot judge a theory's value in the moment. We need the hindsight. He opposed what he called instant rationality, instead favoring a retrospective view of progress. So here I'm going to talk about these threads. One such seemingly productive thread that I've come up with concerns Claudius Ptolemy in the time of Christ. It appears he may have incorporated a subject found in the Ynglinga saga, that the river Tanais, today the Don River, flowed from the mountains of Svitjod, or Sweden, into the Black Sea. Notably, Ptolemy placed the Riphaean Mountains, associated with the mythic far north, over the Black Sea region, so that the Tanais flowed from the Riphaean Mountains into the Black Sea. But the surrounding place names around the Riphaean Mountains show strong correlations with a mountain range in central Sweden. This suggests that Ptolemy may have had access to, or been influenced by, Nordic traditions or oral histories, implying that those traditions are significantly older than often assumed. When we cross-reference this with Pliny the Elder's natural history, we can begin to reconstruct why Ptolemy might have shifted the Black Sea northwest to the point it did towards Sweden. Pliny places the Scythians above a place he calls Buges, which some interpret as a lake connected to the Meotic or the Sea of Azov, while others consider it an unidentified river. Notably, there is a modern Polish river called Bug, which would place Pliny's Scythians firmly in Europe, if you would identify it with that river, rather than in Asia. And crucially, that is exactly the area to which Ptolemy relocates the Black Sea, effectively erasing what we now call Ukraine from the map. And in its place, we instead find Svitjod, the ancient Swedish realm. This strange relocation begins to make sense if we accept that Ptolemy's conceptual geography was influenced, directly or indirectly, by the idea of a Svitjod the Great, the mythic realm said in the Ynglinga saga to stretch deep into Asia, to the land of the Asas. Within this framework, the eastward exaggeration of the map takes on a whole different meaning. It's an artifact of their migration eastward. I place this thread in the generative category because it began as an anomaly. Rudbeck called the Bugis a river, while modern sources called it a lake. And this explanation that I found suddenly yields explanatory power. Not only could this offer insight into the origins of Jordanes and Cassiodorus' Gothic histories, but it also may explain the eastward exaggeration in many ancient maps. That distortion under this paradigm becomes an artifact of the migrations of the peoples of Svitjod the Great. This same framework could even account for why mapmakers placed the Hyperboreans in Asia. And like I outlined in the puzzle board analogy, once you accept a different foundational piece, the rest can begin to snap into place in unexpected but coherent ways. I will stop here for now, though this particular thread generates many more potential reinterpretations. Another thread is that modern etymology strengthens one of Rudbeck's claims, that the Greek word for island, Nisos, comes from the Swedish word for peninsula, Näs. The common theme being a smaller thing connected to a larger whole. You can see my finding in the video, Did Plato Describe a Peninsula? And I will come back to this point later. There are two seemingly degenerative threads, which circle around the measurement of 5,000 stadia, and it generates some seemingly productive threads and some seemingly degenerative. Rudbeck interprets Plato's description of Atlantis as having a height of 5,000 stadia, a figure derived from a literal interpretation, in contrast to more adjusted modern interpretations. He then claims that this matches the length of the Scandinavian peninsula, which he says spans 10 degrees of latitude. And to make the numbers fit, he argues that 1 degree equals 500 stadia, so 10 degrees would equal 5,000 stadia. However, this conversion does not align with any known model of the Earth's circumference. It is much too small. according to modern geography, and even based on Eratosthenes' ancient calculation, the 10 degrees of Scandinavia rather equals around 6,000 stadia, not 5,000. Interesting though, 5,000 stadia is the base unit from which we calculated the circumference. So here is the protective layer hypothesis for this anomaly. If this is indeed the most influential civilization of prehistory, the measurement of 5,000 stadia became a known unit, while it was used by Eratosthenes when he calculated the circumference of the Earth. He used it in Egypt, just east of the Berbers, the true Libya of North Africa, the place Plato compared the size of Atlantis with, which in reality is actually closer to 5,000 stadia. While Atlantis itself, or Scandinavia, is a little bit larger, right? Which it actually is supposed to be, according to the text. This is internally consistent with Rudbeck's proposed lack of clarity among the Greeks and Latins of what belonged to Atlantis originally and what belonged to the Mediterranean area. This point will be explained further in its own chapter. Here is the next seemingly degenerative thread. The island of Ogygia is argued to be another name for Atlantis in Rudbeck's work, as it's called the island of Calypso, who is the daughter of Atlas. Ogygia is by Rudbeck said to be 600 stadia from the mainland, when he quotes Plutarch's De Fasci in 941b. What modern translations render as 5,000 stadia. So here again you have this 5,000 stadia unit. This exact measurement problem of 5,000 stadia or 600 stadia is used in another description which Rudbeck claims to be of the same ocean, Scandinavia's Gulf of Bothnia. And this is in the source of Strabon in 11.61. There, Rudbeck has the width as 600 stadia, while the modern version again has 5,000 stadia. So here is my prediction of what has happened, or what I should find should I search among different variations of the texts. My hypothesis for what has happened is that these sources indeed are the same ocean, which was traditionally described as 600 stadia wide and 5,000 stadia long. The 5,000 stadia measurement won out for two reasons. First is the same argument I just used as a protective layer in the previous point, that 5,000 stadia became a known unit or standard. And the other reason is that Ogygia was later understood to be out in the open ocean, 5 days sail west of England, while the manuscripts with 600 stadia measurements were ruled out. When we come to Ogygia to talk about it in depth, I will show how a literal reading of this passage does permit Ogygia to be 5 days sail from England in the western part of the world, wherein then Scandinavia is the most reasonable option. Speaking of Feyerabend, he famously and controversially argued that science should be seen more as an art form. He pointed out how many of history's greatest scientific theories didn't just explain the world, they inspired awe, beauty, even emotional resonance. Just like in art, trends in science shift in response to what came before. And, he argued, that's how it should be. Rigidly following rules can be productive for a while, but eventually it becomes limiting. This idea struck a deep chord with me. I've always had a creative spirit. I love music. And the same part of me that finds joy in sound finds joy in ideas. For me, exploring ideas isn't just intellectual, it's emotional. It's a form of art. And so, my motivation for studying Rudbeck isn't driven by cold rationality. It's human. I want to understand him to the best of my ability and in as favorable light as I can, because the premise itself fascinates me. Because no one has truly done it this way in modern times. I want to understand why he believed what he believed, and what merit, if any, his ideas might hold, both on their own terms and through the lens of modern knowledge. Did he have good reason to believe what he did? If only questions like that came with a clear yes or no answer, then the world would be far less mysterious. But more often than not, the best we can offer is judgment and rhetoric, and not hard fact. Beliefs tend to exist on a spectrum from good reason to bad reason, and most scholars place Rudbeck's ideas fairly low on that scale. That is, they judge his theory to be highly improbable. Still, almost all give him some credit, especially Magnus Alkarp, who acknowledges his trailblazing methodology, his rigorous attention to detail, and his genius in weaving together disparate sources. On the other end, both Gunnar Eriksson and Magnus Alkarp works are littered with editorial quips. This is, of course, not surprising at all, as this theory comes from a different paradigm. And if you know anything about Thomas Kuhn, you know about the incommensurability of paradigms. This long word means that two paradigms are like two languages. So that two individuals trying to understand each other and their various paradigms will inevitably talk past each other in the moment due to such different experiences, expectations, and assumptions, and the very meanings of words. This not only makes communication fail, it also means you highlight and ignore different things, ask different questions, and use different tools to interpret data, all in all coming to very different conclusions. Not only do you have different views, there's no immediate way to translate it to the other paradigm, even though you both speak the same language. This shows that communication isn't fundamentally about language, It is about shared experiences.
If a lion could speak, we would not be able to understand what he said.
This incommensurability also means the current dominant paradigm is always heavily favored. A scientific textbook in a given paradigm only gives you the most successful parts of it, while retroactively explaining the previous paradigm's failure through its faults. It drastically underdescribes the considerations that go into deciding between paradigms when you are living in between them. This gives the dominant paradigm a sense of inevitability. Here is an example of what that may look like in the case of the Atlantica. Most would agree that Wikipedia generally represents our current-day paradigm. And the article on Rudbeck labels his work Atlantica as historical linguistics, implying the logical foundation are his linguistic musings. But I can tell you that is strictly filtered through the modern lens, which rejects his methodology of using the old historians as reliable sources. Rudbeck himself, as we have said, viewed the sources as the foundation, walls and roof, and the etymologies, the paintings and ornaments. They were, in his own words, the least reliable proof. So you can see how the Wikipedia page basically reframes the weakest aspect of the work as the central argument, inadvertently giving the leading paradigm an increased sense of reason for its dominance. One of the key tasks of a good paradigm is to cohere internally, offer explanatory power, and ideally generate insight or prediction. Surprisingly, Rudbeck's Atlantica does this at least in one intriguing way. He argued that if Atlantis was in Sweden, it could explain the etymology of the Greek word Nisos, today traditionally translated as island, with its etymology being to swim, and secondarily as a peninsula, stemming from the word for nose, with the proposed Proto-Indo-European root Nasya, meaning nose or headland, with cognates in Proto-Germanic and Slavic. Rudbeck anticipated this secondary reasoning when he said that Nisos comes from the Swedish word näs, meaning peninsula, a smaller landform attached to a larger whole. He linked it to Swedish words like nest and even nose, in Swedish näsa, with the common meaning being a smaller thing connected to a larger whole. This line of reasoning is today rejected as the word nest, with Proto-Germanic roots being nista and Proto-Indo-European nistu, and even Sanskrit nida, is supposedly only familiar in sound to the Greek word nisos, but with no common etymological root. The modern secondary theory of Nisos being nose hints at what the commonality would be: a smaller thing connected to a larger whole. This would, however, mean the very word would have spread coherently all the way from Scandinavia down to northern India with the Sanskrit word for nest, nida, hinting more at the old conception of the Indo-Europeans as one coherent group in the Japhethites. That in turn begs the question, were the old scholars right to identify Japheth with the Greek titan Japetus, the father of Atlas in the underworld? If Nisos indeed means Swedish nose, cape, headland, and peninsula, then all of these other aspects of Rudbeck's framework and more deserves a second look. We mentioned some Proto-Germanic cognates here. Now, very recent findings from a solid study of over 100 scientists called Steppe Ancestry in Western Eurasia and the Spread of the Germanic Languages suggests something which feels very Rudbeckian, as the presenter tells us. That is, that the Germanic people seem to have come from Gamla Uppsala, what the article carefully has labeled East Scandinavia, down to Skåne, Denmark, and then to Germany, Holland, and so forth. Rudbeck's research anticipates this in two ways. First, in the sources like Tacitus, Pliny, and Julius Caesar, and then through the language, wherein the Nordic word geir means spare, or even larger in Rudbeck's view, war, where the Spanish word for war, guerra, would come from. Therefore, geirman, or German, means spearman, or warman, i.e. soldier. This also brings us back to the much maligned Goth-Getae Scythian connection, a hypothesis which Jordanes, the 6th century Gothic historian, famously placed in Scandinavia. In modern academia, this idea is widely dismissed as unfounded or even propaganda. But if Rudbeck's broader framework, linguistic, historical, and geographical, is closer to reality than previously thought, then this connection might deserve a second look as well. It may have logical flaws in the modern sense, but it becomes, at the very least, a logical step within the internal consistency of the paradigm we've been exploring. This is where the work of the philosopher of science, Paul Feyerabend, becomes especially relevant. In his controversial but influential critique of scientific rationalism, Feyerabend argued that methodology itself can become a form of dogma. That is, the rules and assumptions we use to determine what counts as valid knowledge may, over time, harden into orthodoxy, even when they no longer serve the search for truth. According to Feyerabend, history shows that scientific breakthroughs often emerge not by following the rules, but by breaking them. New insights frequently begin as heresies within an older system. So, if modern research continues here and there to validate pieces of Rudbeck's thinking, from migration patterns to etymological roots, then perhaps his broader historical framework, however flawed or speculative, is not so easily cast aside. Not because we should now accept it uncritically, but because rejecting it purely on methodological grounds may itself be unscientific. The proper response in Feyerabend's view would be to allow such theories to compete more openly, not shut them down a priori. At the very least, we should remain curious. What might we see if we loosen our grip on current dogma just a little? All that being said, the question still deserves ample attention. Why, it will have its own episode. That is all I had for today. Thank you for following along this far. I wish you a good rest of your day, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye.